You are a highly educated professional, a woman who has spent over a decade mastering one of the most difficult sciences known to humanity, the science of saving the human brain, and you walk into a grocery store simply to pick up fruit and bread for your family only to be publicly humiliated, handcuffed, and treated like a criminal because someone decided you did not belong there. Based on the color of your skin or the assumptions they made the moment you entered that door, this is not fiction, this is not exaggerated. This is the very real story of Dr. Maya Thompson, a brilliant black neurosurgeon whose only mistake was daring to exist confidently in a place where some people thought she should not be. And what happened next was not just an incident of racial profiling, but a reflection of something far deeper, something that touches every community in America and perhaps every corner of the modern world. This story reveals the silent assumptions, the hidden fears, the quiet prejudices that shape the way ordinary people see each other and treat each other. And while this story happened in an affluent suburb of Nashville, it echoes in cities, towns, and homes everywhere. And that is why you must stay until the very end, because this story is not only about injustice or humiliation, it is about survival, dignity, strength, and change. And perhaps by the end, you will see the world around you just a little differently. On that day, Dr. Thompson was not wearing her white coat or her hospital badge. She was wearing casual clothes, comfortable after a long shift, a woman stopping by the store on the way home, just like anyone else, but for one woman in the store. She was not like anyone else for Karen Whitfield, a longtime resident and self-appointed neighborhood watch of this quiet suburb. Maya Thompson was an intruder, a suspicious outsider, and as we have seen in too many other cases, this was enough to trigger fierce suspicion and a phone call to the police. Within minutes, two officers arrived on the scene. Officers Simmons and Hansen, both young, both white, both influenced by assumptions that would soon lead them into national disgrace. What followed was a scene that has repeated itself in America far too many times. An educated professional black woman asked to explain herself to prove she belonged to justify her very presence in a space that should have been safe and normal. But this is not just Maya's story. This is the story of every person who has ever been stopped, questioned, doubted for no reason except the color of their skin or the way they looked in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it is a story with roots deep in American history, long before body cameras, long before social media, long before smartphones captured these moments for the world to see. Back when black men and women in the South were stopped on sidewalks, questioned by sheriffs, asked to show papers or give reasons for their movements. This old injustice dressed in new clothes but acting in the same way. What is shocking, what is heartbreaking, is that no matter her degrees, no matter her titles, no matter her rank as the wife of a decorated military colonel, Maya Thompson was still just another suspect in the eyes of these officers and of Karen Whitfield, the woman who accused her. But this video is not here just to retell injustice. It is here to explore the deeper question: why do these moments happen again and again in America? What is the hidden machinery in society that allows a neurosurgeon to be handcuffed beside the fruit display while nervous customers glance away pretending not to see? This is about fear, about assumption, about the brain's ancient instinct to categorize and separate. But it is also about the failures of training and the persistence of unspoken prejudice. Because according to studies by the American Psychological Association, implicit racial bias still affects decision-making in police work, even when officers claim neutrality, even when departments offer diversity. Training the instinctive response to blackness in a white space remains suspicion until proved otherwise, and that is why Maya's ID did not matter, why her calm explanations meant nothing, why her husband's military rank could not save her from handcuffs, because the real trial happened in the mind of Karen Whitfield. In the moment she decided that the presence of this stranger in her grocery store was wrong and called the police. But this is not the first time nor the last that such assumptions ruined lives. Remember the story of Henry Louis Gates Jr. arrested outside his own Cambridge home because a neighbor thought he was breaking in, or the case of Bobby McKenzie, a black teenager, accosted by store security because they assumed she could not afford a prom dress, despite holding her mother's credit card, or the countless unnamed black men who have been stopped, frisked, detained simply for walking in neighborhoods deemed too wealthy, too white, too safe. These stories matter because they reveal a pattern not of bad apples or isolated mistakes, but of a system in which suspicion is racialized, where safety is equated with whiteness and danger with color. And in this system, no badge or degree can fully protect you. Maya Thompson's humiliation was not an error. It was the logical result of these patterns playing out in public. But what made this story different, what gave it its twist, its fire, its impact, was what happened next. Because Maya Thompson was not married to an ordinary man. She was the wife of Colonel Marcus Thompson, a high-ranking military officer whose arrival at the scene with a convoy of uniformed soldiers changed everything in seconds. Suddenly, the power dynamic reversed. Suddenly, the officers who felt so confident in their authority now faced someone with greater authority, someone who knew the law, who understood rights, and who could not be silenced by a badge. And this reversal is rare, but it is revealing because it shows how quickly respect can be forced when power speaks louder than prejudice. When the military arrives with legal firepower, even the most biased officer must step back. But this also raises a question: why should this be necessary? Why must a black woman need military backup to be treated with the basic dignity given freely to others? Why must power be the price of fairness? This is the heart of the tragedy and the outrage and the sadness of the story. But it is not the end, because something else happened that day, something remarkable that changes the meaning of the story entirely. An elderly man, a bystander who witnessed the unfolding scene, collapsed with a heart attack. And in that moment, Maya Thompson, despite her anger, her fear, her humiliation, acted with perfect professional grace. She knelt beside him, checked his pulse, began CPR, and saved his life. The very woman treated as a criminal became the healer, the savior, the hero of the hour. And this is where the human spirit shines brighter than injustice. Because Maya did not stop being who she was. Because of their hatred, she rose above it. She did what her oath, her training, her heart demanded. She saved a life, and in doing so, she exposed the true smallness of those who had tried to reduce her to a stereotype. This moment reminds us of the story of Dr. Charles Drew, the black physician who pioneered blood storage and transfusion yet died after being denied care in a white hospital. Or the tale of Marian Anderson, the opera singer denied entry to Constitution Hall, who then performed at the Lincoln Memorial in defiance and grace. Because dignity endures, because truth survives humiliation, and in that grocery store, Maya Thompson stood in that same tradition of quiet triumph. This is only the beginning, because, as you will see in the parts that follow this story, sparked investigations, lawsuits, community outrage, and change. But the real change, the most important change, must happen here, in the mind of every viewer who asks, why did this happen and how can it stop? And for that answer, you must stay until the end. Because the lesson of this story is not just about Maya or Marcus or Karen or the officers or even Nashville. It is about America and its unfinished struggle with race, with power, with justice, and with the simple question of who belongs and who is assumed to be out of place. And until we answer that question, truly this story will happen again and again. And that is why it must be told in full, without apology, without fear, because only the truth will set us free. But this story, this deeply unsettling yet strangely hopeful story, did not end with Maya Thompson saving a man's life on the cold tile floor of that suburban grocery store, because what happened after she performed CPR and stabilized the elderly man, while the very officers who handcuffed her stood frozen and helpless, speaks volumes about power systems, about race, about the dangerous assumptions that live in the hearts of too many, and about how quickly the script can change when truth comes crashing into comfortable prejudice. Because as Maya wiped her hands on a paper towel, kindly handed by a store clerk, and stood up from the man she had just saved, something else arrived at the store parking lot. Something no one expected, but everyone would remember forever. A convoy of military Humvees rolled up to the curb, heavy wheels grinding on asphalt, doors swinging open sharply, and out stepped Colonel Marcus Thompson, her husband, a decorated officer whose presence was not simply that of a man defending his wife, but of the full weight of military honor, history, and righteous fury. And as the soldiers disembarked and formed a quiet line behind him, the atmosphere in that parking lot changed completely. Because now the officers who had moments earlier treated Maya like an untrustworthy stranger stood blinking nervously at the imposing figure of a man who outranked them in every way. And this moment is rare but important because it reveals how authority shifts when the familiar social hierarchy is broken. Because here stood a black man in uniform with power acknowledged by the government, the law, and even the police themselves, and that forced them to pause, to rethink, to realize the scope of their mistake. But why must it take a military intervention to reset the scales of justice? Why does respect for black life arrive only when clothed in the garments of state-approved authority? This question has haunted every instance of racial injustice in America from the time of the Tuskegee Airmen, who fought for freedom abroad while facing segregation at home, to the black soldiers of World War I and the who returned to Jim Crow laws and burning crosses. It is the tragic irony of a country that demands loyalty but so often fails to return it in equal measure. And here in this suburban parking lot in 21st century Nashville, that same contradiction unfolded again as Colonel Thompson stepped forward, his voice measured but firm as steel, asking the officers to explain themselves, asking what crime they believed his wife had committed, what evidence they had, what probable cause justified humiliation and handcuffs. And the officers stammered, hesitated, glancing at Karen Whitfield, now pale and sweating as the truth of her false accusation became obvious to everyone. Because the store's security manager had finally reviewed the footage and found no sign of theft, no sign of Maya touching Karen's purse, no reason for any of this but the color of her skin and the assumptions that followed, and now the officers stood exposed, and the small crowd of customers who had pretended not to see now watched in silence, wondering if they would later tell their friends that they had witnessed something historic, something shameful. But here is where the story takes another remarkable turn, because Colonel Thompson did not raise his voice, did not demand immediate arrests, did not unleash the full legal fury he was entitled to. Instead, he calmly asked for names, for badge numbers, for reports to be filed and investigations to begin, because he understood something rare and powerful, that the true enemy here was not these two nervous officers or even the trembling Karen Whitfield, but the larger, deeper system of assumption that shaped their choices, because this system teaches some people that certain bodies are suspicious by nature, certain faces, dangerous by default and undoing, that takes more than anger, it takes action and evidence and persistence. And this is the real battle that began in that moment, because what followed in the days and weeks after this parking lot confrontation was not simply a private apology or a quiet dismissal, but a public reckoning. The video of Maya in handcuffs, the arrival of the military convoy, the scene of an accomplished black neurosurgeon treated like a thief. These images went viral across the nation, sparking outrage on social media and in newsrooms, demands for accountability, pouring into City Hall, the police department, the store itself. And here the story connects to others, like it to the memory of Sandra Bland, arrested and dying in custody for a minor traffic violation, or the case of Christian Cooper, the black bird watcher, in Central Park, falsely accused by a white woman weaponizing police fear, or the many others whose names fill the lists read aloud at protests across the country. This connection is important because it shows that Maya Thompson's story is not rare, it is not strange, it is heartbreakingly normal, part of a pattern, a system that continues to catch innocent lives in its grinding gears. But Maya's story was different in one crucial way: she survived. And because she survived, she could speak. She could tell her story in interviews, in court filings, in public forums. And because she was respected in her field, supported by a husband with military weight, her voice carried in ways others sometimes cannot. And this gave her the chance to expose not just the injustice of one day, but the hidden sickness of an entire system. Because the investigation revealed more than one false arrest, more than one careless assumption. It uncovered a pattern of racial profiling in that suburb, a record of disproportionate stops, searches, and complaints lodged quietly but ignored for years, until Maya's ordeal forced the issue into the light. And here is where real change began, because as the lawsuits were filed, as the department reviewed its training, as the city's leaders held uncomfortable meetings about bias and reform, the ripple effects spread outward. Other towns noticed, other departments checked their data. Other citizens asked hard questions, because one woman's humiliation became the spark for many to reconsider their blind spots. And this is why stories like this matter, because they reveal not only injustice, but the cracks in the walls. We thought were solid, the flaws in the systems we trusted, and the ways those systems can be rebuilt if we have courage. But the price of this change was high for Maya and Marcus, because in the weeks after the incident, their home was vandalized. Hateful messages spray-painted their hospital, received threats. Surgeries, reassigned colleagues grew distant whispers in the corridors of retaliation and warning. This is the quiet cost paid by those who speak out. The isolation, the danger, the fear that standing for justice will bring the wrath of those who prefer silence. But they did not back down. They stood firm. They gave interviews. They pursued legal action. They spoke to young Black students about knowing their rights. They refused to leave their home or apologize for daring to exist where others thought they did not belong. And in this, they echoed the courage of those before them, of Rosa Parks, who refused to stand, of the Little Rock Nine, who faced mobs to enter school, of Dr. King, who marched. Despite the threats, because justice always demands a price, and they were willing to pay it. And yet, even as they fought for truth, life continued. Maya returned to the hospital, to the operating room, to the delicate dance of brain surgery. Her hands steady as ever. Her mind focused, because saving lives was who she was, no matter how the world misjudged her. And in this, she showed the deepest strength of all, the power to endure, to heal, to rise above hate, not with weakness, but with skill and grace and quiet power. And this part of the story matters most, because it reminds us that dignity is not given by others. It is claimed by the self, held in the heart, and lived out in the face of cruelty. Maya Thompson lived that truth every day in every patient she saved, every student she taught, every neighbor she greeted, and her story is now part of a greater movement, a tapestry of resistance woven from the lives of those who refused to be defined by prejudice, who stood their ground, who claimed their space, and who forced the world to see them not as threats but as human beings, worthy of respect and equality. And this is where you, the viewer, must reflect, because this is not just Maya's story. It is your story. It is the story of your country, your town, your workplace, your mind. Because these assumptions, these fears, live everywhere, in policies and practices and habits, and they will not die unless you face them, unless you choose to see and change and speak. And that is the real ending of this part of the story. Not in the courtroom, not in the settlement, not in the headlines, but in the quiet decision of every person to be better, to think twice, to judge less, to listen more, because only then will the world Maya Thompson saved that day in surgery and in protest be a world truly worth living in. As the days turned into weeks after that unforgettable afternoon in the suburban grocery store, the ripples of what happened to Maya Thompson and her family only widened, because this was not merely about a false accusation or an overreaction by police. This was about the deeply woven fabric of a community and a system that had for years quietly tolerated suspicion, prejudice, and exclusion. And now, for the first time in a long time, the cracks in that fabric were being exposed for all to see. And the exposure did not stop at the grocery store. It reached into the homeowners association of the neighborhood where Maya and Marcus Thompson lived, where neighbors who once smiled politely at block parties were now revealed in emails and text messages to have spoken privately of discomfort at having a prominent Black family in their midst, whispers of property values and keeping the neighborhood safe, language that has for decades masked the old disease of racial exclusion in the new clothes of suburban respectability. And this revelation shocked many who had thought their community was better, more modern, more accepting. But history shows that such illusions rarely survive real scrutiny, because the pattern seen here has played out in cities and towns across America, from the redlining practices of the 1950s that locked Black families out of homeownership to the modern tactics of zoning laws and HOA rules that silently maintain segregation long after the civil rights marches have ended. And as journalists dug deeper into the local police department's records, more disturbing facts emerged: traffic stops disproportionately targeting Black drivers, arrest records showing unequal charges for similar offenses, complaints from Black residents that had been ignored or dismissed, all of it hidden until Maya's ordeal forced the doors open. And this exposure mattered because it broke the spell of denial that so often covers systemic injustice. It showed that what happened to Maya was not a mistake but a symptom, not an accident but a warning light on the dashboard of a broken system. And this is why the story went beyond local news and into national headlines. Why civil rights organizations took interest. Why lawyers specializing in racial discrimination cases called the Thompsons offering support. Because everyone who heard the story knew that this was not an isolated event, but part of the long, ugly history of assuming that Black presence in a wealthy white space is suspicious by default, and that assumption has cost lives, freedom, dignity, opportunity, and safety for generations from Emmett Till, whose presence in a white-owned store cost him his life, to Trayvon Martin, whose walk through a gated community marked him as danger to Ahmaud Arbery, whose jog through a neighborhood led to his murder. These stories are linked by the same thread, the same deadly suspicion that demands explanation for Black existence in certain spaces. And Maya Thompson's story added another chapter to this painful record. But there was more, because the backlash was not only public, it was personal. In the hospital where Maya worked, subtle changes began to happen. Her surgery schedule reassigned her referrals, reduced whispered warnings from colleagues that her outspokenness was making the administration nervous. Because in a system where profit, reputation, and silence are valued, speaking out against injustice can bring punishment even to those who save lives. And this revealed yet another layer of the system of control. The quiet pressure to stay quiet, to not make waves, to accept indignity for the sake of career stability, a pressure that Black professionals have felt for decades in medicine and law, in academia, in business, because those who rise high are often reminded that their place is conditional, fragile, dependent on their willingness to ignore injustice. But Maya refused. She spoke. She gave interviews. She called for reform. She supported young Black medical students. She reminded the world that excellence is not protection against prejudice, and her courage inspired others. Her story shared in forums for Black doctors and surgeons, echoed by those who had faced similar quiet humiliations, being mistaken for nurses or janitors, being ignored in meetings, being questioned about their right to enter the hospital lounge. This is the silent burden carried by too many Black professionals, the knowledge that their competence, their degrees, their brilliance are too often unseen by eyes clouded with old assumptions. And here the story reaches its deeper moral, the truth that no individual success, no personal excellence can fully protect against systemic bias, that the problem is not the individual, but the system itself. And this is why personal responsibility lectures ring hollow, why respectability politics fail, because the issue is not how perfectly a person behaves, but how broken the societal lens remains that judges them. And yet, even in this truth, there is hope, because exposure brings the chance for change. And change began to happen, not fast, not complete, but real. In the town where this story unfolded, new training requirements for police officers were proposed, bias awareness sessions were made mandatory, community forums held to hear the voices of Black residents long ignored, and in the hospital, administrative reviews began to check for racial disparities in patient treatment, in doctor promotion and hiring. And for the first time in years, the invisible became visible, the unspoken acknowledged. And this is the hard path of progress, slow, painful, resisted by those who fear loss of comfort, but necessary and made possible by the courage of those like Maya, who refused to be silent. But perhaps the most remarkable development was what happened when the life Maya saved that day returned to thank her. Because the elderly man she revived, Walter Jenkins, was the father of a retired police captain. When this fact became known, it brought a strange twist to the story, because the captain spoke publicly in defense of Maya, praising her skill, her grace, her refusal to let injustice stop her from saving a life. And this broke some of the resistance among the local police. Some who had privately grumbled about her lawsuits now silenced by the simple truth that she had saved one of their own. And this is the unexpected power of goodness, that even in the face of injustice, doing the right thing can reach across the lines of prejudice, can change hearts that argument and anger cannot. And Maya's quiet heroism that day became her greatest defense. Not because it erased the wrong done to her, but because it revealed her true character, undeniable, unshakable. And this truth spread beyond the town, inspiring editorial sermons, classroom discussions, because in a time when division seems endless, when fear and anger poison the public square, her example reminded people that dignity, grace, and courage still matter, still change things. And this is the lesson you, the viewer, must carry forward, that when you see injustice, speak. When you see silence, break it. When you see fear, offer courage. Because these small acts build the future, they break the cycle, they expose the lie that nothing can change. And Maya Thompson's story proves that one person's stand can ripple outward into law policy hearts and minds until the world slowly shifts toward justice. And this shift is happening slowly, unevenly, but surely, and you can be part of it, because this story is not over. It lives in you, in your choices, your words, your vision of the world to come. And that vision must be clear, now less blind to old assumptions, more awake to hidden injustice, more ready to act, because only then will the sacrifice and courage of people like Maya and Marcus Thompson bear the fruit they deserve. But even as local change began, as departments reviewed policies and community leaders promised reform, the story of Maya Thompson and Colonel Marcus Thompson did not fade away, because what happened in that grocery store parking lot was now part of a larger national conversation about race justice and belonging in America. A conversation that stretches back decades and touches every corner of this country, from the most crowded cities to the quietest suburbs. Because this story is not rare. It is only rare that it was recorded, that witnesses stayed, that the victim survived, and that her husband carried both military power and legal understanding enough to force the truth into the light. And this is why people across the nation paid attention, because they saw themselves or their friends or their fears. In this story, they saw the echoes of Breonna Taylor, whose home was invaded in the dark because police believed her boyfriend might be a threat. They remembered Eric Garner gasping for air on a sidewalk because suspicion over selling cigarettes cost him his life. They thought of the parents who warned their black children how to speak, how to move, how to survive encounters with authority, just to stay alive. And these memories made Maya's survival feel miraculous, but also infuriating, because it showed how close America remains to disaster, how fragile justice is when built on unequal foundations. And as these thoughts spread, the media began to ask harder questions. Why had the officers not checked the security footage before handcuffing Maya? Why had Karen Whitfield's unfounded accusation been believed without evidence? Why did no one stop to question why a black woman could not be shopping peacefully in a grocery store? These questions led to wider scrutiny of the police department, the store's management, the homeowners association, and soon the town's political leaders felt the pressure because the public wanted answers, change assurances that this would not happen again. And this is when the quiet defenders of the old system appeared, people who wrote editorials warning about rushing to judgment, who whispered that Maya should have simply been polite and patient, who suggested that racial bias was not the issue, that it was all a misunderstanding. But history teaches us that such defenses are the last shields of crumbling walls, because every great injustice in America has been excused at first with claims of misunderstanding, from slavery's apologists to Jim Crow's defenders to those who justified school segregation. They all said, wait, be patient, let the system work. But for the victims of injustice, patience is pain, delay is suffering, silence is consent. Maya Thompson, like those before her, refused to be silent. And this refusal mattered deeply because it broke the spell of polite forgetting that lets injustice return again and again. Because as the Department of Justice opened its civil rights investigation, as civil suits moved forward, as media coverage refused to die down, real fear grew in the hearts of those who had hoped this story would pass quietly away, and this fear produced action, small but real. The police department announced mandatory bias training, the grocery store revised its security response protocols, the homeowners association removed members implicated in racist communications, and these small changes began to matter because they showed that Maya's suffering had not been in vain, that exposure had forced repair, that truth spoken in public had changed private systems. But beyond these technical fixes, something else began to change, something more important. The townspeople began to talk openly about race, suspicion, belonging. For the first time in years, uncomfortable truths were spoken in living rooms, churches, classrooms, because Maya and Marcus Thompson became not just neighbors, but symbols of the American struggle for belonging. And this struggle touched every race, every class, because fear of the other is a disease that sickens all who carry it white. Fear of black presence, Asian fear of black neighbors, Latino suspicion of black youth, all of it fed by the same poison spring of ignorance and unspoken history. And this is why Maya's story mattered to everyone, because it revealed the hidden lines that still divide communities, the silent walls that separate hearts and minds, even in an age of diversity and technology. And this revelation brought opportunities for healing, because when truth is spoken, when lies are broken, there is room for understanding, for repentance, for rebuilding. And in the weeks after the incident, these signs of hope appeared. Community dinners hosted by black and white families together town. Hall meetings where residents of color told their stories, and where finally heard school projects where students traced the history of segregation in their own town and found the marks of the past in their streets and schools. And these small acts began to reshape the town's sense of itself, no longer a place of quiet exclusion, but of noisy truth-telling, of struggle. This matters profoundly because change that lasts begins not with law, but with culture, with memory, with shared story. And Maya's story now belonged to the town's memory, its shame, but also its redemption. And yet the personal cost remained high for Maya and Marcus, because change brings enemies as well as friends. Threats mailed to their home, hateful messages left on their car, warnings from those who resented being made to see the truth. And this danger was real. History teaches that those who break silence often suffer violence. Dr. King assassinated after speaking truth. Malcolm X gunned down after calling for change. Medgar Evers shot on his own porch because courage always threatens comfort. And Maya and Marcus knew this, but they stood firm. They refused to move, to hide, to apologize, because they understood that history would judge not the danger they faced, but the courage they showed, and this courage inspired others. Black families in nearby towns wrote letters of support. Other professionals of color came forward with their own stories of quiet humiliation and injustice. Community leaders offered protection and support, and slowly the wall of fear began to crack. And in this growing light, the most powerful moment came when Maya was called upon again. Not as a victim, not as an activist, but as a doctor, because weeks later, a young boy badly injured in an accident arrived at her hospital in need of emergency brain surgery. And when she read the chart, she froze, because the boy was the son of Officer Hansen, the very man who had handcuffed her in the store. And this moment brought every pain, every anger, every question flooding back. But Maya took a breath, gathered her strength, and walked into surgery, because she was a healer, because she had sworn an oath, because dignity is not given by those who wrong you, but held in your own heart. And the surgery was long and difficult, but successful. The boy lived, recovered, and when Officer Hansen visited Maya afterwards, his eyes full of quiet shame, he thanked her, and she simply nodded. No anger, no triumph, only quiet grace. And this moment changed him, broke him, remade him, because for the first time he saw Maya not as a suspect, but as a person, as a healer, as the woman who saved his son. And this crack in the wall of prejudice mattered deeply, because it showed that even hearts trained in fear can change when touched by human truth. And this is the greatest lesson of the story, that injustice is not destiny, that fear is not fate, that change is possible, but only when truth is spoken, when courage is shown, when grace is offered even to those who least deserve it. Maya Thompson showed this grace, and in doing so, she rewrote the story of her life, from victim to victor, from suspect to savior, from silence to speaker, and her town slowly followed. And this slow change matters, because the deepest evils are slow built and must be slowly undone, because prejudice layered for centuries cannot vanish in a day. But it can weaken, crack, shift under the weight of truth and courage. And Maya's story placed another crack in that ancient wall, and you, the viewer, can carry this change forward, because how you see the old, the different, the other shapes the world you build. And this is why you must remember this story, why you must speak it, why you must make sure that the next Maya, the next Marcus, the next child will live in a world where such injustice is impossible. Because only when every person is seen as human will justice be real. And that is the dream Maya and Marcus now carry forward. Not for fame, not for revenge, but for their children, for their neighbors, for a country still trying to be free. And so this story continues in every choice you make, in every voice you raise, in every truth you tell, until the day when no one needs to call soldiers to be treated with respect, until the day when justice is ordinary and grace is common and dignity belongs to all. And so as the quiet transformation unfolded in that small Tennessee town, as Maya Thompson's story spread, from newsrooms to classrooms to kitchen tables across the country, something deeper began to stir. Because what happened to Maya and Marcus and the neighbors and officers who knew them was not simply a lesson about one moment of injustice or one clash of suspicion and truth, but about the fragile fabric of America itself, a fabric stretched thin by years of hidden fear and unspoken wounds. And this fabric showed signs of tearing signs that could no longer be ignored. Because Maya's grace and courage had not only changed the officers who wronged her, or the hospital that had feared her rising voice, or the neighborhood that once whispered behind closed doors, but also the way strangers across the nation saw their own neighbors, their own assumptions, their own silent habits of distrust. And this reflection mattered because history shows that moments like these ripple far beyond their origin, shaping laws, minds, and memories in ways no one can fully predict. Just as the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins began with 4 students, yet sparked national change, or how Rosa Parks' quiet refusal to move set wheels turning that reshaped the South, so too did Maya's stand awaken others across industries and towns. Because in hospital boardrooms, in police academy, classrooms and homeowners association meetings, new questions were now being asked: who is welcome here? Who is assumed guilty? Who is trusted by default? And these questions, once taboo, now hung in the air because they could no longer be denied. And the answers mattered because they determined who would feel safe, who would thrive, who would be seen. And these answers began to change slowly, unsteadily, but truly. And perhaps the most important change was this: that ordinary people, neighbors, co-workers, strangers began to speak. When once they stayed silent, began to question. When once they assumed, because Maya's story had shown that injustice flourishes in silence, that the worst wrongs happen, not only when the cruel act, but when the good say nothing. And this truth rang out in every town where similar stories lived, half hidden in memory. The black realtor questioned by police showing a house in Michigan, the Latino father arrested in his own driveway in Arizona. The Asian student accused of cheating for speaking her native language in a dormitory. These stories connected now by the thread of Maya's courage, by the proof that exposure could bring change, and the hope that others might follow. And this was not mere sentiment, for changes, real and concrete, began to happen in Maya's town. And beyond, the police department added new training modules, crafted with input from civil rights groups. The local college launched scholarships for minority students in criminal justice programs. The hospital created a mentorship network for young doctors of color, pairing them with senior staff to break the silent barriers of career progress. And these steps mattered deeply because they struck at the roots of the quiet inequality that fed the public injustice. They reduced the chance that the next Maya Thompson would be mistaken for a thief or a threat. They built the foundation of a new normal where dignity was not a reward for success, but the starting assumption for every human being. And yet, as progress moved slowly, the resistance remained, not in the open, not in courtrooms or official statements, but in the quiet grumbling of the old guard in private forums online, in whispered warnings that the world was changing too fast, that people like Maya were stirring trouble. And here the danger lay, because history shows that backlash follows progress, that every step toward justice brings pushback from those who fear loss, who see equality as threat. Maya and Marcus lived with this shadow, their home guarded by security, their routines cautious, their friends carefully chosen, because courage carries cost and speaking truth invites danger. But they refused to retreat to silence, to regret, because they knew the truth of every great reformer, that safety without justice is no safety at all, that comfort bought with silence is not peace. And so they endured, standing firm, speaking openly, answering every interview, every subpoena, every question, because the stakes were too high to do less. And in this endurance, they found allies, people of every race who stood beside them, veterans who wrote letters of support, doctors who shared their own hidden stories, teachers who changed their lesson plans to include the truth of Maya's experience. And this gathering of allies mattered because it showed that the old walls could crack, and that from those cracks, new community could grow stronger. braver, more honest. And this quiet alliance began to shape the town's culture, its daily life, its sense of who belonged and who mattered for in grocery stores. Now clerks greeted Maya with warmth, no longer fear in parks. Strangers nodded in respect, no longer suspicion in schools. Children wrote essays on justice, using Maya's name as a symbol of courage. And this cultural shift was the most important change of all, because laws can be passed, policies written, but hearts must change from within. And this change had begun, and it spread beyond Maya's town, to neighboring counties, to state capitals, to national discussions on policing and race and community safety. Because her story now lived in public memory, a lesson to be cited, studied, remembered like the names of others who stood for justice before her. And this is why her story matters not only for what it changed in one town, but for what it reminds us all that progress is possible, that change is slow but real, that courage costs but also redeems, and that dignity must be claimed not given. And this lesson is old but needed more than ever because the dangers remain, the quiet profiling, the hidden fear, the silent judgments that shape who gets stopped, who gets trusted, who gets to walk free. And this is why you, the viewer, matter, because this change depends on more than laws. It depends on eyes that see differently, on minds that question their first assumptions, on lips that speak when silence would be easier, because only then can Maya's story bear full fruit. Only then can the next Maya, the next Marcus, the next innocent neighbor live free from fear and full in dignity. And this future is possible, but not promised. It must be made, built day by day in every town by every person. And this is the challenge her story gives us: to speak, to act, to refuse silence, to demand better. And so her courage becomes ours, and her victory becomes our hope, and her suffering our warning. And this is the meaning of her story: that injustice defeated once can be defeated again, that truth spoken once can break 1,000 lies, that grace shown once can heal a bitter heart. And this is the legacy she now carries and the burden she has borne, so that we may walk a clearer, freer path. And so as the final chapters of this remarkable and painful story unfolded, what became clear was that the true power of Maya Thompson's stand was not in court settlements or media coverage or public statements, but in the quiet, lasting change in the minds and habits of ordinary people. Because every time someone in that town paused before assuming the worst about a stranger, every time an officer double-checked their reasons before reaching for cuffs, every time a neighbor stopped to greet Maya with real warmth. Not fear, that was the victory, and these small victories mattered because they built a new pattern to replace the old one. A pattern of caution, not in fear, but in fairness, of slowness, not in hesitation, but in thought. This change spread in ways no one could have fully planned, because Maya's hospital, seeing the national attention and feeling the pressure from public opinion, moved beyond mere public relations to real policy shift, creating a new patient rights council led by Maya herself, focused on ensuring that no person of color receiving care would feel unwelcome, unheard, or unsafe. A small step, but a real one. And in the police department, a review of past complaints led to the quiet dismissal of officers with patterns of bias, not with scandal, but with the simple fact that their presence was now a risk the community would no longer tolerate. And these actions slowly rippled outward, inspiring other towns to examine their own silent prejudices, their own unspoken fears. And this matters deeply because, as history shows, the great changes of society rarely begin with presidents or kings, but with small local shifts. Rosa Parks' quiet refusal sparking a city's bus boycott, the sit-ins at lunch counters. Beginning in sleepy Greensboro, the first Pride marches starting in small groups before shaking the world. And so too, here the change began in the simple fact that a neurosurgeon grocery shopping refused to accept humiliation, refused to stay silent, refused to move away. And this refusal forced the whole system to shift 1 inch toward justice. And this inch mattered more than any speech or law because it showed that resistance works, that truth can crack even the hardest walls, and that courage in the face of insult can awaken a town to its better self. And yet the danger remained because backlash followed not openly, but in the private messages, the threatening phone calls, the cold stares at the hospital, the sudden discomfort at neighborhood gatherings because the old guard does not surrender easily. Maya and Marcus knew this. History teaches that for every step forward, there is resistance. The Freedom Riders attacked the civil rights workers, murdered the first black mayors driven from office by threats, and this pattern echoed in their lives now. But they stood firm because they knew that courage means accepting the risk, not avoiding it, because dignity demands a price, and because they were not alone. Their supporters stood too. Black doctors and veterans and church leaders, white allies and Latino neighbors, young activists and old friends. And this alliance mattered because change driven by many hands lasts longer, stands firmer. And so the town's story began to change from a place of shame to a place of healing. Schools invited Maya to speak. Students heard her story, asked questions, learned empathy. Young police recruits were taught her case as a warning in a lesson town. Leaders embraced reforms not out of fear, but because they began to believe in this cultural shift was the deepest change of all, because culture shapes laws, shapes habits, shapes who feels safe and who does not. And now, slowly, painfully, this culture was shifting. And yet perhaps the most profound change was within Maya herself, because the woman who had once believed that her degrees, her status, her excellence would protect her, had learned that in America they sometimes do not. That race cuts deeper than rank, that fear ignores achievement, and this hard truth broke something in her faith, but built something stronger in her resolve, because she now saw the world not as she hoped it was, but as it truly was. And this clear vision made her stronger, fiercer, more ready to fight for those who had less power than she, for the patient afraid to speak for the young doctor, afraid to complain for the neighbor who feared eviction. And this resolve turned her pain into purpose, her anger into action. And this transformation is the oldest story in justice movements: the wounded healer, the hurt turning to help the oppressed, becoming the liberator. And so Maya stepped forward not as a victim, but as a leader, and the town began to follow. Because people crave courage, they hunger for clarity, and when they see it, they rise. And so the hospital changed, the police changed, the schools changed, and most of all, the hearts of the people changed a little. Not enough, not complete, but real. And this matters deeply because every great change begins this way. One life, one choice, one refusal to bow, and Maya's refusal became the seed from which new dignity grew. And as the months passed, the awards arrived, the honors, the speaking invitations, but these were not the real prize. The real reward was in the quiet safety. The next black mother felt shopping in that store, in the respectful nod the next black doctor received in the hospital lounge, in the thoughtful pause the next officer made before assuming guilt. And this safety, this dignity, this quiet respect was the treasure Maya and Marcus had fought for, suffered for, and won. And it would last because it had been earned, not given. And this is the lesson for all who hear this story: that dignity must be demanded, not awaited, that safety comes not from silence but from speech, and that justice is not a gift but a fight. And this fight belongs to all of us, because the walls of prejudice stand not only in courts or councils, but in our own eyes, our own habits, our own fears. And they fall only when each of us chooses to see differently, to act bravely, to speak truly. And so this story does not end here, because its lesson walks with you. The viewer in every store you enter, every stranger you meet, every judgment you form, it asks you to pause, to wonder, to listen, before you leap to fear or anger or doubt. And this is the real victory of Maya Thompson. Not the headlines or the settlements or the reforms, but the quiet change in you, the watcher, the listener, the citizen. Because this is how justice grows, not in thunder, but in whispers, not in marches alone, but in moments. And this moment is yours. And if you carry its lesson forward, if you live its truth, then the world will change again, 1 inch, life one story at a time. And this is the hope, the gift, the promise of Maya's courage and Marcus's strength, that the next time it will be different, the next time dignity will win without a fight. And this future is possible, but only if you choose to make it real. But as the dust settled, as the media crews left, and as the cameras turned to the next headline, what lingered in the hearts of the people of that Tennessee town and across America was not the scandal or the anger, but the quiet unease, the deep recognition that this could have happened to anyone or anywhere, that no matter how successful or brilliant or careful a black woman might be, she was still vulnerable to suspicion, to judgment, to the assumption of guilt because of centuries of stories told about people who look like her. And this realization mattered more than any court case or policy change because it touched the oldest truth about American life, that the shadow of race is long and dark, and that undoing its power requires not just new laws, but new eyes, new hearts, new ways of seeing. And here is where the story of Maya Thompson and Colonel Marcus Thompson offers its most painful but necessary lesson, that no amount of personal excellence, no collection of titles or degrees, no shining uniform or public award can fully armor a person of color against the ancient suspicion of the other. And this is the wound that must be faced before it can heal, because in every part of this country, in every town, there are echoes of the same assumptions that trapped Maya in that grocery store that day, echoes in the whispered warnings about which neighborhoods are safe or good for families, echoes in the stares at the black father at the playground, with his children, echoes in the surprise when a black woman introduces herself as a doctor or a judge or an engineer. These small moments add up. They teach the next generation. They shape the quiet rules of who belongs and who does not. And this is why Maya's story matters beyond her town, because it exposes these rules to the light and forces everyone to ask themselves what they believe about who belongs and why. And this self-examination is the hardest work of all because it demands honesty, discomfort, humility, and yet it is the only way forward because history shows that when injustice is seen but not changed, it grows stronger, more hidden, more dangerous, and when injustice is challenged but only in public, it returns in private. And so the true test for Maya's town was not the news conference or the lawsuits, but the years to follow the daily choices of its people, the habits that form when no one is watching. And this is the test that faces every town, every viewer, every citizen. Because racism is not only a matter of acts, but of structures, systems, beliefs, patterns, and these change only when minds change. And minds change only when courage meets truth and truth meets grace. And here Maya showed the way by refusing to be small, by refusing to vanish, by saving a life when she could have cursed, by healing the son of the man who humiliated her, by standing not in hatred, but in quiet, unyielding dignity. And this kind of strength is rare, precious, necessary, because it shows the path forward for others who suffer. Others who wonder if speaking up is worth the price because they see in Maya the answer that courage costs, but changes that truth hurts, but heals that dignity, demands but delivers. And in this quiet legacy, her story lives on, not as a moment of shame, but as a spark of hope, because the hospital where she works now offers not just care, but trust. Because the police academy teaches not just law, but respect, because the neighborhood where she lives now hosts not just parties, but honest conversations, because the schools where children learn now speak not only of presidents and wars, but of prejudice, injustice, and change. And this cultural shift, slow, fragile, imperfect, is the true monument to Maya's courage, because it reaches into the future, shaping not just today, but tomorrow and tomorrow's tomorrow. And this is how real progress happens, not by miracle, but by memory, by remembering the cost of forgetting, by honoring the pain of those who stood before, by choosing to see what once was hidden. And this choice now belongs to you, the viewer, the citizen, the neighbor, the friend. Because in your town, your store, your hospital, your school, the same patterns may live, the same assumptions may breathe, and they will not die unless you see them, unless you challenge them, unless you change them. Maya Thompson fought this fight, but she cannot finish it alone, because every person of conscience must stand beside her, must carry the light forward, must refuse the old lies and embrace the hard truth that justice requires effort, that equality demands work, that belonging must be defended. And in this work, all are needed, white and black, Latino and Asian, young and old, rich and poor, because injustice wounds the whole body, not just its parts, and healing must touch every cell. And this work begins not in protests or politics alone, but in the small daily moments, in the greeting offered without suspicion, in the smile given without fear, in the assumption of good instead of danger. And this is the power you hold to shape the next story, to prevent the next injustice, to build the next peace. And this power is real because change is not magic, but choice, repeated choice over time, until the new way becomes the normal way, until dignity is as common as air, until respect is as expected as sunlight. No. This is the world Maya dreamed of. The world she fought for, the world she almost lost and finally won. And this world can be yours if you choose it. If you carry her lesson into your life, your family, your community, because only then will her suffering bear its full fruit. Only then will her courage plant its full garden. Only then will her story end, not in fear, but in hope. And this is why her story matters. Why you must remember, why you must speak, why you must act, because the future is written by those who care. And courage is the pen, and truth is the ink, and the page is waiting for your words, your deeds, your choices. And this story, this painful, beautiful, necessary story of Maya Thompson, is only the beginning of what you can write and the world you can create. And now as we reach the quiet end of this long and painful but deeply necessary journey, it is time to ask the question that matters most. The question that every viewer must carry beyond this video, beyond this story, beyond the screens and headlines and lawsuits. What kind of world do you want to live in? What kind of town do you wish your children to inherit? What kind of daily life will you help create? Because the story of Maya Thompson and Colonel Marcus Thompson is not just about race or policing or military rank or legal rights. It is about belonging, about dignity, about the small, simple right of a human being to exist in peace without fear, without suspicion, without needing to prove their right to be where they are. And this right matters because it is the foundation of freedom, and freedom matters because without it, every other promise of democracy is a lie, and this truth is old as time. Because in every civilization, the battle for who belongs, who is trusted, who is feared, who is welcome, shapes the fate of all, and America has struggled with this truth from its birth, from the first stolen lands to the first stolen lives, from the broken treaties to the broken chains, from the dark ships of slavery to the bright streets of protest. This is the story that haunts every town, every family, every law. And now it haunts you because you have heard this story and you cannot unhear it. And the question is, what will you do with it? Because if this story ends only as a memory, only as an interesting video, only as a passing outrage, then nothing changes. Maya Thompson will face the same handcuffs, the next Marcus will bring the same soldiers. The next innocent life will be marked guilty by the same old fear. But if this story changes you, if it sharpens your eyes, if it awakens your heart, if it stirs your voice, then the future may yet be different. And this difference begins small. Not in grand marches or sweeping reforms, but in simple moments, the moment you see a stranger and assume safety. Not danger, the moment you speak to the quiet old man at the bus stop and hear his story. The moment you teach your children to greet every face as human, not as threat. And these moments build upon each other like bricks in a new foundation, like seeds in a new garden, until slowly, patiently, stubbornly, a new world rises where dignity is not a gift for the lucky, but a birthright for all. And this is not fantasy. This is history, because every right we enjoy was once a dream. Every freedom we hold was once forbidden, and every justice we cherish was once denied. Until someone dared to imagine it real. And so this is your turn to imagine, to dare to hope to believe that the world Maya and Marcus fought for can be built not by others, not by heroes, but by you, by neighbors, by strangers, by ordinary people doing extraordinary things like telling the truth, like refusing to laugh at the old racist joke, like defending the quiet outsider, like voting for leaders who see all as equal, like standing when silence would be safer. This is how change begins, how it always begins. And this is the lesson that must live after the court cases end, after the officers are disciplined, after the cameras move on, that the real work is slow, daily human, and it belongs to us all. And so what do we take from this story? What do we remember? What do we carry into tomorrow first? That excellence does not shield the innocent, that degrees and medals and uniforms cannot stop fear when fear is old and deep and blind. Second, that courage matters, that to speak, to refuse, to stand in quiet dignity can shake the walls of old injustice. Third, that grace is power, that to save the life of a stranger who wronged you, to heal the wound cut by another is the highest strength, the greatest victory. And finally, that hope lives not in courts or headlines, but in you and the quiet choices you make each day. To see, to listen to, believe in the worth of every face. And if you do this, if you live this, then Maya's story does not end here. It lives in your hands and your eyes and your steps. And this is the victory that no handcuff, no insult, no injustice can ever take away. And so we close this story not with despair, but with challenge, not with sorrow, but with promise, because the arc of the moral universe may be long, but you can help bend it toward justice. The road of equality may be steep, but your steps can climb it, and the wall of fear may be high, but your voice can crack it, and the day may come when the next Maya walks into a store, and no one stares and no one doubts. No one fears, and she buys her bread and fruit and walks home in peace. And this small, quiet victory will be the proof that we have learned, that we have grown, that we have changed, and this hope is real if we choose to make it real. So let this be the lesson you carry. Let this be the truth you speak. Let this be the courage you show. Because Maya Thompson dared to stand, and because she stood, the world moved. And because you have heard this story, you too can stand and move the world. And this is how justice grows, not in noise, but in silence, not in glory, but in grace, not in rage, but in quiet, unyielding hope that refuses to die. And so the story ends, but the work begins, and the future waits, and the question remains, what will you do now? And your answer will shape everything that comes next.